Hello everyone, my name is Anna. I welcome you all back to another English video where we're going to continue analyzing the good news of Mark. In today's video, we are going to be studying chapter 10, but before we begin with today's chapter, first we're going to do a quick recap of what we studied in the previous video, which was titled, "The First in the Kingdom Believe and Serve as Living Stones." And it was based in chapter 9 of the Good News of Mark. In this video, in this chapter, we first started reading about the transfiguration of the Messiah, which, as we read, was witnessed by his three disciples, Peter, James, and John. In this transfiguration that had occurred, we were reading that what Yeshua had told his three disciples about the fact that there would be some people who would not die before seeing the kingdom of Elohim descend with power was fulfilled in the lives of these three disciples. And on the other hand, we were also reading about the liberation of a demon that Yeshua did towards this child, which we read first in this chapter that his disciples were not able to expel this demon because of the lack of their belief. Once again, let's remember that his disciples were capable and had everything that was needed to take this evil spirit away from this child. However, due to their lack of belief or their lack of confidence in doing this act or performing this miracle, Yeshua teaches them or exhorts them in how they were lacking in believing, and therefore he calls them a generation of disbelief. And that's what we saw in this chapter 9. We were also reading about how Yeshua teaches us about the path of a true disciple, which, as we were studying, it is to be called as servants who, instead of seeking to receive an exaltation from a person or being recognized by a person, they rather give themselves as a living sacrifice to the service of the Father. And this is because, just as we read in chapter 9, the greatest in the kingdom is the one who humbles themselves, who denies what they want and what they want. And this is because their priority, whether it be a he or a she, is to be known and approved by their Creator and not by a person. Finally, in this chapter, we were also reading about the warning that Yeshua gives towards those people that make believers stumble. And we were reading that they will receive a severe judgment, which they will suffer in. Yeshua taught us in this section the importance of examining our words and our actions as well, so that in that way we do not fall or we do not become those stumbling blocks that make other people fall, especially the believers in the Messiah. And Yeshua also taught us the importance that we analyze and that we examine our words and actions, so that everything that we do and the way that we live, in other words, that our life is in accordance to the will and always fulfilling the will of the Eternal. And in that way, it is how we can become those living stones which edify or which build the lives of others. So that's what we saw in the previous chapter, or in the previous video, which was based in chapter 9 of Mark. In today's study, we are going to be reading chapter 10 of the Good News of Mark, and the corresponding video for this study the corresponding title for this study is Following the Messiah Like Children, Leaving the Earthly Things. In this chapter, we're going to be reading different topics which at the end of everything are going to be giving us a teaching and at the same time an exhortation of how we should be, especially if we call ourselves true disciples of the Messiah. And we're also going to be receiving a teaching of what our focus should be on and who are the people, who are the souls that will enter the kingdom of Elohim and that therefore would receive or will receive the eternal life, which we're going to be reading that only comes or that we only receive through the Messiah. And well, the first topic that we're going to be reading in this chapter 10 is what Yeshua has to say regarding the topic of divorce, whether it is acceptable or not, especially in the lives of the true believer. In addition, we are also going to be reading about an exhortation that Yeshua gives to all of those who read his words or his teachings about the person who seeks the earthly things or the earthly wealth or riches. And just as we're going to be reading in this chapter, Yeshua says that those people will not be able to enter the kingdom of Elohim because their gaze is in the world, is in the material things, and therefore they're not going to have that eternal life. And in this, we're going to be reading about the example that Yeshua gives of the young rich man. We are also going to be reading in this chapter 10 about the importance of being like the children, living like the children, which is in obedience without doubt or without questioning the faith or the Eternal's words or even the Messiah's teachings. Leaving all the earthly things behind in order to follow Yeshua the Messiah, and therefore being able to enter the kingdom of Elohim, which, as we're going to read within this chapter 10, Yeshua brought to humanity through his perfect offering. Or actually, this is something that we're going to conclude with at the end of the studies that we're doing of the Brit Hadashah, the first good news of Yeshua. And well, with this brief introduction of what we saw in the previous video and what we are going to be reading in this chapter 10, let's begin by reading verses 1 to 12 of chapter 10. And it says, Yeshua left that place and went into the area of Judea and across the river Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him. As usual, he taught them. Verse 2, some Pharisees came to test Yeshua, asking him, does the law allow a man to divorce his wife? What did Moses command you? Yeshua replied. Verse 4, they said, Moses allowed a man to write a letter of divorce and send her away. Yeshua replied, you were stubborn. That's why Moses wrote you this law. Verse 6, but at the beginning of creation, Elohim made them male and female. That's why a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. Verse 8, the two of them will become one. They are no longer two, but one. So no one should separate what Elohim has joined together. Verse 10, when they were in the house again, the disciples asked Yeshua about this. He answered, what if a man divorces his wife and gets married to another woman? He commits adultery against her, Yeshua said. Verse 12, and what if she divorces her husband and gets married to another man? Then she also commits adultery. In this topic that we read within these verses about the divorce, we can see that first it was used by the Pharisees to try to tempt the Messiah into probably contradicting himself or even contradicting the Eternal's scriptures. However, we can read in Yeshua's response that instead of this topic that the Pharisees asked Yeshua about, instead of it being a quote-unquote trap, to make him fall into contradiction or into lying, they were rather demonstrated by Yeshua the opposite. Why? Because they were demonstrating by asking Yeshua this question about the divorce. They were demonstrating the perfection of Yeshua. And this was because we can read in Yeshua's response that not only did he answer with what had been said in the Torah, which is words given by the Eternal for the people of Israel. So not only was Yeshua responding with what it is said in the Torah, since we can read that Yeshua was not teaching his personal thoughts or his personal teachings or what he believes, etc., something that would happen within the religion or with the religious people, that they would mostly focus in what they personally thought what was correct or how it had to be done or what is still applied and or what needs to be added. So here Yeshua firstly contradicts or proves to these religious people that he was not like them, that he was not giving his own interpretation of what the Eternal had said in the Torah. Rather, he was stating what it is said in the Torah, and this is something that this is what we can read about this topic of divorce that Yeshua mentions in these verses of Mark. It is based in what is said in Genesis 2:24, where it talks about the purpose of, or the reason why the Eternal created man and woman, and how when they would leave their families to become one, they would become one and they would not be two, and therefore no man can separate what the Eternal had done. So this is the first thing that we can understand, and that we can understand within these verses of the divorce. Another thing that we can see within these verses is that it mentions, how I was saying, it mentions the law that Moses gave to the people of Israel regarding the permission given to a man so that they can give letter of divorce to their wife. And this is something that we have already analyzed already analyzed in our Torah studies that we were doing back then or a while ago. And this specifically, we're going to be focusing on what is said in Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 through 13. But the verses that I'm actually going to be reading right now is the first 4 verses of chapter 24 of Deuteronomy, where it tells us about the conditions or the reasons the reasons of why a man could divorce from his wife. And we can also read the conditions or the reasons in which a woman would be able to remarry or to marry another person. The verses say, Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 to 4, it says, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her away from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Eternal. Do not bring sin upon the land that the Eternal, your Elohim, is giving you as an inheritance. Just as we read within these verses, the only reason as to why a man would be able to give a letter of divorce to his wife, was because he had found something indecent about her wife. That was in the case of the man. In the case of the woman, if she got divorced and remarried another person and that person died, she was not able to go back to her previous husband. Rather, she had to maintain herself single. Single. Why? Because if the ex-husband and the ex-wife would remarry again, then they would commit adultery. They were going to bring sin upon the land, the promised land that the Eternal had given to the people of Israel. And then they would be detested, that they would be seen as or they would be detested by the Eternal. Why? Because the woman had already been defiled. She was already impure. So these are the two main reasons as to why these are the two reasons as to why a man was able to divorce from his wife, and why a woman wasn't able to remarry her previous husband. So, reading what we can, or now that we've read what Moses had said about this topic of divorce, with this we can see, and at the same time it makes us understand that from the beginning of the history of the people of Israel, there already existed this problem with the people, not only the man but also the woman, on how this topic of divorce was something that the people of Israel had dealt with since the beginning of their history. And just as Yeshua said, and this was because just as Yeshua said in verses 5-6 of this chapter 10 of Mark, the only reason why this law about divorce was given to the people of Israel was because of their stubbornness. In other words, it was because of their hardness of heart, because they wanted to act like the nations. They wanted to act like those people who lived in the darkness and not in the light, which is the Eternal's word. So since they wanted to live like the other nations, it is a reason as to why Moses ended up giving them this commandment, or this mandate, because of their hardness of heart. Just as Yeshua said within these verses, for what the Eternal made from the beginning, which we can see like literally in the beginning, Genesis chapter 2, is that the man and woman have to be one, and it is perfect. However, with this that we read in not only this good news of Mark, but also what we read in Deuteronomy 24, is that over the time, this topic or this problem about divorce was something that just kept getting more complicated and more complicated throughout the time, focusing in what the people of Israel would practice, or the way that they would live. And although we can also see in the history of the people of Israel that the quote unquote reasonable causes of divorcing a woman began to change, or they began to continue adding more reasons as to why divorce was allowed within a couple, was because of the given interpretations that the religious schools of that time where Yeshua was, they would keep adding into, or for their followers or their believers. And these two schools that were religious schools and that would be adding their interpretations into the laws that are found within the Torah are called the schools of Hillel and Shammai. And these schools were putting in different ways and at the same time at opposite extremes the various reasons as to why a man was able to or could divorce his wife and therefore remarry another woman. Although it is also important to mention that it also depends on the laws change according to the school to which the person or the man would belong to. For example, one of the schools, they were more rigid and therefore they were not flexible with their laws or with their laws. And on the other hand, there was a other school where they were more liberal and therefore, well, basically they had more freedom of living however they wanted to, but still living with the laws that were given by the religious people. So in short, what we can read of what the religious schools would add to the laws of the Eternal, and the reason as to why Moses gave permission for the people of Israel to be able to divorce, and also how the Pharisees asked Yeshua about this topic of divorce. In all of this that we have been reading, we can see, specifically focusing on what Yeshua responds, is that he does not separate himself, Yeshua, he does not separate himself from the Torah. Rather, he makes it clear, showing the perspective and the original plan of the Eternal, which, just as he said in these verses, that from the beginning of creation, the Eternal made them male and female. And for this reason, it is why a man shall leave his father's and mother's house, and therefore the two of them shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two fleshes, but just one. And thus it is showing that the problem itself is because of the hardness of their hearts, because they were stubborn, which is why the commandment was written or was allowed for them or was given to them. So in Yeshua's response, it clarifies that marriage is not to be separated, nor is it correct to leave a wife or to leave a wife and go remarry another person, because then they would be detestable unto the eyes of the Eternal, because it was something that simply it was not allowed. And these two actions that we can see being lived not only by the people of Israel, but also that continues to be lived by the people of the world, whether they have a religion or not. If we pay close attention to this problem that exists within the world, it gives us a very valuable lesson and a very valuable exhortation of how us, if we call ourselves true believers, if we call ourselves people or believers, that we are consecrating ourselves, that we are saving ourselves, that we are preparing ourselves for that person who we are going to unite ourselves with later on in the future. If we let ourselves get carried away by appearances, whether it be that they're good looking, or that they're tall, or that they're skinny, or that they're short, or whatever, if we focus in what we can physically see, then we are going to fall into this big error that we can find within the people of the world. So this teaches us that we must be paying attention, that we must be analyzing of the person, or from the person that we're going to unite ourselves with, of what is inside, what are their actions, if they're producing those good fruits, if they're truly being actual believers of the Messiah, or if they're actually living in faith, or if it's only or if they're only pretending to be something that they're not. So this teaches us the importance not only of analyzing the other, like the person that we are going to unite with, but also mainly it teaches us of how first we have to examine ourselves. First, we have to apply everything that we read within these verses, of how it is important that we consecrate ourselves, that we save ourselves, that we prepare ourselves for this union that we may get to have if it's the Eternal's will. And therefore, we are not going to fall into this great error that humanity lives in. And that Yeshua himself exhorts us so that we make sure that we do not fall into this mindset that we can marry and remarry or marry and divorce whoever we want to. And well, this is what we can read within these first verses of chapter 10. Continuing now with verses 13 to 16, it says, people were bringing little children to Yeshua. They wanted him to place his hands on them to bless them. But the disciples told them to stop. When Yeshua saw this, he was angry. He said to his disciples, "Let the little children come to me. Don't keep them away. Elohim's kingdom belongs to people like them. What I am about to tell you is true. Anyone who will not receive Elohim's kingdom like a little child will never enter it." Verse 16. Then he took the children in his arms. He placed his hands on them to bless them. In these verses that we can read of this chapter 10, we can read that the disciples, seeing the people or the people who were bringing their children so that they can receive this blessing from Yeshua. Not only does this, or making a side note here quickly, it confirms to us that the fame of Yeshua had already reached many on how Yeshua was the actual Messiah, so much that they were taking their children to Yeshua so that they can receive a blessing from him. And well, this is what first we can see, or we can note from what it is written in these verses. Secondly, we can see that that the disciples of Yeshua, seeing that these people or that these children were approaching Yeshua to receive a blessing, they stopped them, or they stopped these children from receiving this blessing. And this was because they saw the children as something lesser, or as something that they didn't really understand who was Yeshua, or what was Yeshua's purpose, or what Yeshua was doing. That's the point of view, or we can say that was the point of view that the disciples had, and that is what led them to prevent these children from getting closer to Yeshua. But we can read the reason why, as to why the disciples view the children as something lesser, was because they were children. And simply, as adults, we normally think that children do not have the knowledge, or are not prepared, or not capable of knowing what things are important and what things are not important. And this is something that the disciples thought, so therefore that's why they acted like that. But in these verses, we can read that Yeshua tells his disciples to let them go with him, to not stop them from coming to him. And this was because the kingdom of Elohim, just as Yeshua said in these verses, is for people like them, people like these children. It is to say, it is for people who believe and act like children. Now, it is also very important to clarify that here Yeshua, when he says to act like children, to act like children, he was not referring to like literally, like physically act like those children, like immature or childish, or etc. Yeshua was not referring to this. What Yeshua was saying was that he was mostly focusing in the fact that, and something that we can see with children, that we get to see sometimes, whether it be cousins, whether it be brothers, whether it be even our only children, or even any type of children that we can see, we can realize that these kids, or these children, they believe, they trust in what an adult tells them. They don't doubt in what they are being told, but rather they believe without doubting, or even without questioning. So this is what Yeshua was referring to. That's what he was saying, to the fact that the children believe without doubting. And an example that we can use to better understand what Yeshua was referring to when he said this about the children, is that, for example, if an adult tells a children to obey in public and therefore they're going to receive a prize, or they're going to be able to have to go to the playground, or they're going to be able to do something that they like or get something that they like, etc., the children obviously and naturally, they're going to believe, they're going to trust what the adult is saying. They're not going to doubt, they're not going to question, they're going to do it, they're going to actually listen, they're going to obey, they're going to believe. And this is exactly what Yeshua was referring to, that that to act like those children, to act without hesitation and believing what we are being told. So understanding this, it is exactly what Yeshua is referring to when he says that the people who act like children, it is to say, who believe without doubting in the Messiah, then they will receive the kingdom of Elohim. But if we are like those people, well, this is not what we read within these verses, but something that we can also come to a conclusion and understand from what Yeshua is saying is that if we're like those people that do not listen, that do not believe, that always doubt, that do not trust, that are always questioning everything in their lives, that simply they just don't feel, they're just not comfortable, they're not satisfied with their lives, and they're always doubting, then those people are not going to be able to enter or to receive the kingdom of Elohim. Why? Because they're not believing in what truly is important, which is the Messiah and the Messiah's words, and also Yeshua's the Eternal's instruction. So these are two main things that us as believers, and reading what Yeshua says here, we must always make sure that we are acting like those children, that we believe without doubting, and that we are not questioning what the Eternal allows to happen within our lives, but always understanding that the Eternal has full control of our lives, and that everything that happens in our lives is with a purpose, so that we can learn and so that we can grow. And this is what we can learn from these verses of chapter 10. From verses 17 to 31, we can read about what Yeshua teaches of the rich young man. It first starts describing that Yeshua, or that a person came to Yeshua who, in addition of being a rich young man, he also claimed to keep the commandments of the Eternal. We read that it seems that this young man not only did he cared about his material things, what he had achieved throughout his life, but he also cared, in other words, he wanted to know, or his focus was in how is it that he can receive that eternal life. We can even read within these verses that he goes to Yeshua and he asks him, what should he do to inherit eternal life? And it is narrated in these verses that Yeshua first notices when this man approaches him, he first notices this young man obedience, because just as we can read within these verses, it does say that he kept the commandments from a very young age. We can also read that Yeshua, later on, when they're having this conversation, he notices this hypocrisy or this doubt in this man. And this was because, although, yes, we can read that this man kept all the commandments of the Eternal, he would fulfill them. However, Yeshua tells him that he still had one more thing to do in order for him to obtain that eternal life. And this was regarding to his riches. Yeshua tells him in these verses, go and sell what you have and give it to the poor. Doing this, you will have treasures in heaven. After you sell everything, return to me and follow me. This ordinance that Yeshua gives to the rich young man teaches us that we as believers specifically, we cannot have both things at the same time. We cannot choose, or rather what we have to do is we have to either choose the wealth of the world, what the world can offer us, the passions of the world, etc., or we can choose the eternal life, which requires us to leave everything behind, all the worldly things behind, the riches, the friends, even the family, the doctrines, etc. We must leave all of that behind in order for us to be able to obtain that eternal life. We cannot be having our focus in the earthly things and then still expect us to be able to receive the eternal life. We can also read within these verses that this hypocrisy of this young man was because when he heard the Messiah's answer, he was not satisfied with it. It was not something that he was planning to do or even that he wanted to do. He was therefore receiving or hearing Yeshua's response, he was saddened to know that he had to abandon all of his wealth. And instead, we can read that what he does is that he leaves all sad. He leaves sad by what he had heard, and decides to go after riches and not the eternal life, which, as we know, and as this, not only the eternal life is not only important for the believers in general, it's important for the souls. As souls, we understand and we know that we have a creator and that it is important that we return to our creator. We have that necessity in us to return to our creator. The creator, although humanity has been living in rebellion, although humanity does not want to obey the eternal, they don't want to do nothing with the eternal being merciful, he has sent his son Yeshua the Messiah so that he can become that path that takes us to the eternal. And therefore, when we accept Yeshua's sacrifice, and when we decide to live in that obedience and in that consecration towards our creator, then it is how we can receive that eternal life. When we leave all the earthly things behind, it is where, and we choose the eternal life, it is how we become those true and obedient children of the eternal. And even we apply this teaching that Yeshua says to live like the children, to act like the children, in obedience, believing without doubting. Analyzing Yeshua's response, it teaches us that salvation is not something easy, it is not received with an enormous faith, or that is based in feelings and emotions that lead to a momentarily decision, or even that it is driven by words of another person. But rather, Yeshua teaches us that salvation or eternal life can only be received through the Messiah. No one else can give it to us. Not a rabbi, not a pastor, not a priest, not a leader, not any person. No person can give us that eternal life. Only the Messiah. And this salvation, it is based on believing, receiving, accepting, and most importantly, obeying the word of the eternal and his son Yeshua. Understanding all of this, it is how we receive this exhortation from Yeshua to make sure to not live or even act like this rich young man that we can read within these verses, who went after the things of the eternal, which are momentarily, instead of going or choosing to have his gaze and put all the effort in receiving that eternal life. Reading all of this, it teaches us that we must try to live and act as Yeshua teaches us with his own life, him being that perfect example of how we as believers should live, living in obedience and always doing the will of the eternal, giving giving our own lives just as Yeshua did. for the service of the Father, not letting ourselves be carried away by the world and its desires and its passions, but rather pilgriming as those true believers, as those obedient childs of the eternal, maintaining ourselves in that consecration and that consecration and that obedience towards our Father, so that in that way we are able to receive this eternal life through the Messiah, and therefore we do not fall into the passions, the desires, the wealth, the riches, everything that the world may offer, and that at some point in the human life they could be seen, or actually they are seen as something nice, as something that we desire. However, those things are just not only momentarily, but they are also the reason as to why humanity gets further away from the eternal. So with this, it gives us a great lesson, a very valuable lesson as how we must live as those true believers, taking the example of Yeshua and despising the example of this rich young man. From verses 35 to 45, we can read about the request of the disciples, James and John, that they gave towards the Messiah. And this was in accordance to what they thought about the Messiah that they were waiting for. And once they saw this coming of the Messiah, who was with the disciples themselves, the disciples being those or testifying of the coming of the Messiah, and how they were able to see and to hear everything, or all the service that the Messiah was doing, or that the Messiah was fulfilling. They believed that he would take their place, which is Jerusalem, and they would free them from the Romans, establishing himself in an earthly kingdom in which the important places wanted to be occurred by these two disciples. So with all of this, or in other words, we can see within these verses that the disciples of Yeshua, James and John, they thought that Yeshua was going to be here, and that he was in this world, and that he was going to establish his kingdom here in this world, and that these two people, or these two disciples, wanted to be those two important people that were going to be at the side or beside the King Yeshua. But this was a belief or a thought that was given by the religious people to the people of Israel. And we can also see that this thought or this belief was something that was not based in the Torah, but rather in the religious people and the religious leaders. And so we can see in these verses that this request demanded a lot from them. Why? Because they showed that they were willing to suffer. They were willing to suffer and go through the same thing as Yeshua, in order to receive, to be able to receive this request that they made towards Yeshua. However, we can read that Yeshua taught them that it should not be like that, that they should not be focused in the earthly kingdom that they thought was going to occur, that they should not focus in the power or in the power that they could have in this world. Rather, Yeshua teaches them that their gaze and their thinking should be according to to the celestial things, that they should have humility, which according to his words and example was to be the greatest. They had to be the greatest. They had to be that, the disciples had to be that example of those true believers, of those true disciples of the Messiah, having their gaze not in the earthly things or expecting an earthly kingdom, but rather having the gaze in the celestial things and understanding that Yeshua's kingdom was something, or is something celestial. And at the end of all of this that we can read within these verses, of what Yeshua tells them, of what, or of how the disciples had to be, how they had to live, we can read within the letters that were written for the nations by the emissaries. We can read that that's what ended up happening to them. That's how they ended up living just as Yeshua had told them, that they would suffer in this world, that they were going to be mistreated, persecuted, beaten up, murdered. They were going to falsehoods were going to be brought against them. Even they were going to be judged unjustly. And this is precisely or exactly what we can read within the letters for the nations that the emissaries wrote, that happened with these disciples and apostles. Their lives were not for themselves. They were not living their life to the fullest. They were not living a simple life, but rather they were living a difficult and painful life. And even so, and although they were going through all this suffering physically, however, they understood that they had to go through it, to all those tribulations, since their gaze was on receiving the earthly promises. And they didn't care how they were going. They didn't care of how they were suffering physically, or what could happen to them physically, but rather they cared more of how they were being seen by the Creator, on that they were but to them they cared more about them being accepted by the Eternal, and they didn't care if they were rejected by the human beings. And they got to this point, or they mentally got to this point, because as I said, their gaze was on receiving the heavenly promises, where they knew and they understood that once they received those heavenly promises, they were no longer going to be suffering, and they were no longer going to be in pain, but rather in these heavenly promises that were brought by Yeshua for humanity, it was going to be a place of peace, a place of rest for those obedient souls. So once again, this teaches us how our life should be. Although we probably are not going to be suffering the exact same way that they were going through. We're not going to be persecuted. We're not going to be probably beaten up. We're not going to be murdered, etc. We're probably not going to go through what these disciples went through, or what the situations that they had to go through. But however, we still must always remember and try, or we must always remember and make sure to not care what the world thinks of us, what they say about us, or what they believe about us, but rather we must care to keep our eyes on the heavenly promises, making sure to remain in obedience and consecration before our Creator. And this is something important that we must make sure that we apply, and that we maintain in this mentality to not care what the world thinks or what the world can do to us physically, but rather fear the Creator, and fear the Creator who can destroy our souls. So we must always maintain ourselves in that obedience and in that consecration towards our Father. And to finish with the study of this chapter, verses 46 to 52, we can read this miracle that Yeshua does for this blind man named Bartimaeus, who lived in Jericho. We read that this man's blindness went beyond a physical condition. Rather, it was something spiritual. We can even read in these verses that Bartimaeus recognizes that it was something spiritual. He no longer thinks that it's something physical that can be healed immediately, but rather he recognizes, he understands that it has to do, or that it is focused mainly in his spiritual condition. We read that not only does he identify this problem that was with his condition physically, but he also recognizes his spiritual state. We can even read within these verses that he, as it says in these verses, he let go of his mantle, or he puts his coat on one side, and by him doing this, he puts in motion his faith, or his belief in what was written about the Messiah Yeshua, and which Yeshua himself was fulfilling at this time. And this is referring to what we can read that the prophet Isaiah had prophesied within the book of Isaiah, chapter 61, verse 1, where he says, "The Spirit of the Eternal is upon me, because the Eternal has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to blind up the brokenhearted." So this is exactly what Yeshua was doing. Yeshua was performing miracles to those who were in need, to those who not only were in need of receiving of being well physically, but most importantly of being well spiritually, so that they can see this fulfillment of the coming of the Messiah, and therefore they would have that opportunity to return to the Father through the Messiah. Because once again, the Messiah was that path that can only take us back to the Creator. As well, we can read throughout the good news, and that we've been reading throughout the good news of Matthew and of Mark, and that we're going to continue reading in the good news of Luke and John, is that Yeshua was bringing that he was bringing he was healing the brokenhearted. He was healing the brokenhearted. He was making those people who were in need being fulfilled with miracles, with teachings, with liberation of demons, with being healthy, receiving health, etc. So this is exactly what Bartimaeus realized that Yeshua was fulfilling with. He was fulfilling with what had been prophesied about him in Isaiah 61, verse 1. So we can read in these verses that after Bartimaeus recognizes his spiritual state and decides to do the right thing, which is to believe that Yeshua was the Messiah that the Eternal had prophesied and also promised through his prophets towards the people of Israel, Bartimaeus receives his sight physically, but not only that, also spiritually. And in this way, it leads him to follow the path of the Messiah. And this is a great lesson for us of the importance, once again, of having that faith, of believing without doubting, of the moment that we recognize that we are in the wrong, that our spiritual state is not good, we must make the make things correctly. We must correct our path, correct our life. And this is the miracle that we receive through the Messiah, that when we used to live in the darkness, we used to not be able to see anything. We used to believe in the doctrines, in the religious interpretations, in what the world tells us what we have to do and what we don't have to do, etc. But the Eternal, in the Eternal being merciful towards humanity, allows and gives a chance to every human being to return to him through the Messiah, to receive that light of the eternal through the Messiah in the lives of these souls that understand and have the necessity of returning to their Creator. And in conclusion of what we have analyzed and learned from this chapter 10 of the Good News of Mark, we receive a teaching and exhortation of how we should live, act, believe, think, etc., especially if we say that we are true disciples of Yeshua the Messiah. The main point that we see in these verses is the importance of seeking to believe and obey like children, never questioning or even doubting what we are being taught and ordered only by the scriptures of the eternal and the words of the Messiah, not what other religious people have to say, not what other people have to say, not what the human says, but what the eternal and the Messiah say in the scriptures. And just as the title of this study says, following the Messiah like children, leaving the earthly things. And well, this is all for today's video. This is all for today's study. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that you learned something from these words of the Messiah, from the good news of the Messiah, the miracle that we saw, the teachings that Yeshua gives to us. Thank you once again, and we will see each other in the next one.